Greetings, everyone. This is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever, and this is going to be the conclusion of the video series I've been doing called Does Hashem Have Emotions Like a Human Being? Again, this is the conclusion. Again, if you've watched the previous videos, and if you haven't, I suggest you go to the very first one, which was the introduction. I presented some information about, in English, how the term emotions is defined. And I explored it from the psychological perspective. Because of the fact that, generally speaking, terms like this are defined as physiological and psychological, which, if you look at the definitions provided in the site that I'm showing now, which was described in previous videos, essentially, emotions in English are considered to be connected to physiological and psychological, I guess you could say situations within the human body, as within the human psyche, if you will. As they mention here, that emotions have individuals, or how individuals deal with matters of situations they find personally significant. Emotional experience has three components: a subjective experience, a physiological response, and a behavioral or expressive response. Now, again, this is all defined in terms of the English language of how it relates to humans, because of the fact that this is something that people can relate to and see, and also experience and also relate to. Now, again, you can go to the previous video where I went through, what this site says in terms of, how to feel, define emotions. It's in the previous videos. Now, what's important is the question that someone should be asking now is, okay, I've dealt with the English in several videos, and in the last one, for example, I dealt with actual sources, about the characteristics that are considered to exist for the source of creation. Meaning, again, we're talking about the source of creation, what created everything in reality, and itself was not created. Meaning that even if one wanted to claim that there was like something that created the universe, but then something had to have created that, well, we're going back to what created everything, for example. So we're saying that there's nothing that created the source of creation. This is the source of the ability for there to be creation and the source of what actually created everything. Okay, so that must be clear. Whenever Jews are talking about Hashem, we're not talking about like, gods in the sense of English. That's why there are some situations where there's some Jews in English who actually write, instead of writing the word God, they'll write out G with a dash D instead of putting an O there. So try to make a distinction in what it is that they're talking about. But of course, I don't. That's not something that I personally do. But if we're talking about the creator of all things, which we'll use the term Hashem, which we've been using, um, that's what we're talking about. So in terms of this whole idea of emotions, one question can be, well, how does all this fit within the Hebrew language? Because if we're addressing it from the English language, and if I'm saying that the English is not sufficient to describe something that was ancient Hebrew, all the way through Mishnaic Hebrew and even modern Hebrew, how does this fit within the Hebrew language? Next, what words in Hebrew mean emotions? Um, and are they applied like that way to Hashem? So these two questions are actually really easy to answer in the Hebrew language. And first of all, let's start from modern Hebrew. In modern Hebrew, generally speaking, when someone is talking about emotions, the words that are used are regesh for the singular, emotion. Emotions, plural, would be regashot. So again, regesh and regashot are the two terms generally used to speak about emotions in modern Hebrew. Now, if one were to look up what the word regesh, or as we say, emotions, in modern Hebrew, how exactly is it defined? You could look at Wikipedia, for example, and get a definition. Now, what's interesting for those who don't know this is that because this is modern Hebrew, there are a couple of words here that are actually not Hebrew words by their origin. They're actually English words, which also English words usually come from other languages also. Um, and sometimes I get tripped up on the words that are actually English, but they're like written in Hebrew, Hebrew script. So basically what it defines regesh or emotions as the following. regesh הוא מצב פיזיולוגי שמלווה בשינויים נוירופיזיולוגיים הקישור למחשבות, תחושות, תגובות התנהגותיות ורמה הדונית של הנאה או סבל. So essentially, translate what this means is this follows the same track as the English, because again, we're talking about a word, in modern Hebrew that follows in track with usually the English definitions. And some of the sources that you see here that have numbers on them, meaning that it's areas where they're referencing something. If you look in the Wikipedia, it's actually referencing English text or articles about emotions from the psychological standards of how these things are defined. And essentially, what this translates into is that it's basically defining emotions the way we saw in the English, that it's something physiological, and it deals with things that are thoughts, feelings, reactions, behaviors, and things that deal with either like let's say the enjoyment of something or struggling of something. But again, if we're talking about something that is a human thing, which is all this is all describing human things, and even further, it goes on to describe that. This is something that, as we know, is considered to be a human thing. But this is modern Hebrew, and again, it borrows from the English. So if we were go to the basically psychological the it's like a site basically that deals with psychology from here in Israel. It's the psychological in Hebrew. There's basically kind of like a mini, I guess, description or course. It's called Bet Sefer LaRegeshut, Maze Regesh, and it's dealing with from a psychological perspective. So essentially what they describe is the following, which I've highlighted in the yellow. הרבה לפני הפיזיולוגים וחוקרי מוח שאלו את השאלה מה זה בעצם רגש, שאלו אותו פילוסופים. So essentially, what they're saying is before people who, basically who research and deal with, the physiological aspects of the mind, before they ask the question, well, what are emotions? What is regesh? It basically says the philosophers, the philosophs, in Hebrew, English you call it the philosophers, were the ones who dealt with this issue. Then he continues and says, Lifnei 1,300 shana, הפילוסוף אוריסטו דיבר על חמשת החושים שיש לנו, ראיה, שמיעה, טעם, ריח, מימוש. So essentially what he says is that, before 2,300 years ago, the philosopher Aristo, spoke about this issue in terms of, five different emotions, essentially being, connected to like I guess you could say the senses actually, of like sight, hearing, taste, smell, and feeling. So basically dealing with the senses itself, not exactly emotions just yet. And then it continues, והוא דיבר על החוש השישי, חוש שהוא קורא לו חוש כללי. So he says that basically that Aristo dealt with like this fifth sense, basically the sixth kind of sense, which he kind of said was like a general like feeling, and it continues, says, ומה שאני רוצה לומר, שהחוש הכללי הזה, אלה בעצם הרגשות שלנו. Now, this is important because this says that the person who wrote this article was saying that essentially what he wants to say is that this this sense that this sixth sense that Aristotle was talking about, this general sense, is what we would say are basically our emotions, meaning our emotions, dealing with from a human perspective, not dealing with anything beyond humanity, for example. Then it goes on to describe it, but it's interesting to note that what he's basically saying is that these issues were first, if you will, in the modern sense, brought up by philosophers such as Aristotle. So on some level, this is like a philosophical issue when you deal with what exactly are emotions. It's more of a philosophical question rather than like a constant that where you can definitely say, well, this is definitely what it is, going back thousands of years in terms of its definition. So going to another site that deals with, here in Israel, with these issues of, emotions, what do they mean, and how to relate to them in terms of, dealing with issues and social issues that people face. I went to the Merchaz Rimon site, and they give a similar definition, where at the top in the highlighted they say, Regeshu lema'aseh teguva shel adam legoram o irua mesuyam al pi rov, irua chitzoni. So essentially, what it says there is that regesh, or as we say, emotions, and is basically dealing with the actions of response of a person, of a human being, compared to like where they live, and also like different events that like or think causes, different causes, and also events, specific events, and per like the majority, it's like something external that are the events that cause these emotions, if you will. says חשוב להדגיש את העניין החללה. כי במצבים מסוימים אותם ניתן לראות פעמים רבות אצל אנשים ובעיקר ילדים, עם הפרעות קשב וריכוז. רגש או אז יכול לצוץ גם תגובה לאירוע פנימי לחלוטין שנסתיר מעיני הכל. So essentially what they're saying here is like they're giving the definition again that we've seen previously in terms of how emotions are described, basically dealing with things that are physiological and external to the human being that affect us, either where we can show the effect, for example, or we kind of internalize the effect. But still, it's dealing with something that's on a human level. Now, going a little bit further in the article, what it basically mentions at the bottom, which I just showed, it says like Regashut Borin Hafizlogia, and this is from Eldan Dahan, which is one of the contributors to this article. And again, it's important to note that when they're dealing with this, they're also dealing with it from a physiological point of view. So it says Hokrim Rabim Hit Anyanu B'She'ala Maze Regashot. He says like a lot of researchers have dealt with this question of what exactly are emotions. לאורך השנים נמצאו מספר הסוברים למה הם רגשות וכיצד הם פועלים ומשפיעים עלינו. כיום אין הסכמה מלאה לתשובה מה הם רגשות. So essentially what he says is that for a long time there have been like a number of people who explained it from the perspective of the things that happen in our lives and also influence us. And he says like today there's still not like a consensus about what exactly are emotions, if you will. So this is interesting to note because again, if we're going to use this term in the sense of describing the source of creation, but yet the definition in its modern sense is dealing primarily with something physiological that isn't fully completely agreed upon, it's almost like you can't really use that term. So it's basically like saying you can't really use that term on something that created everything, especially using the modern definitions of what people define it as, because again, as we mentioned in the previous video, most Jewish sources agree that the creator of all things is not a physical being like us, is not like us at all, if you will. So to place things that we can't even define amongst ourselves, for ourselves, on something that is way beyond humanity, is just something that you can't really do, with the exception of what the Torah tells us we can say about it. And even then we have to understand what that even means. So, I missed this last part, but what was also another part of this discussion in this particular article, where it says at the bottom, Hagdara hamikubelet hi, meaning that the kind of accepted definition, Ragashot hem matzav hamamtaer chavaya ishit shel adam, vehem kololim mispar marchivim נוספים שמתלווים עליהם מחשבות, תחושות גופניות והתנהגות. So essentially, this gets into the whole thing where this article basically says that, what are the things that has kind of been accepted as the definition is that, emotions basically are a state or a situation that describe things that are like of a personal issue that happen to people. And, they basically also include, different aspects of, how the person thinks, how a person feels, physically, and also like, the behaviors. So again, this deals with physical things that are physical in our realm of understanding of physical, in basically humanity in terms of its definition. So the next question that someone can ask, okay, but what you've talked about modern Hebrew, but what about ancient Hebrew and Mishnaic Hebrew? How exactly are emotions defined in that context? Well, what's interesting is the modern word we talked about earlier, regesh, which is used in modern Hebrew to describe emotions. In ancient Hebrew, Mishnaic Hebrew, and Talmudic Hebrew, generally speaking, the word regesh doesn't denote emotions the way that we describe them nowadays in modern Hebrew or in English. That one of the definitions given in the Jastrow Dictionary of Targumim, which is like the translations from Aramaic to Hebrew and back and forth, and also the Talmud and the various midrashic texts, it defines regesh as commotion or vibration, and this is even true for like ancient Hebrew. That generally speaking, regesh is mentioned, defined as something that's a vibration or commotion, which is what leads into the idea of modern Hebrew that you can use the word regesh to define the word emotions in English, as some kind of commotion or vibration. But generally speaking, it isn't like defined as emotions the way that we describe them now. Now, another form of the word ragash is defined as to tremble, shake, be agitated, to moan, different things like that, to be affected, ragish, so there's, again, it doesn't like define it as emotions, the way that people define it now, but it does have some elements to it that lead into how how this word was chosen in modern Hebrew to represent the word emotions. But what also has to be noted is that there's another word called midah or midot. Now, I once saw on a site where it was a site on Kabbalah on the Sifriyot, and I won't get into that because I really don't like to try to describe that kind of a thing to someone who doesn't really have a Torah-based background. But essentially, one of the words that was being used to translate into emotions was midah or midot. Now, the thing is, midot and midah usually don't, or most people don't translate them into emotions, not the way that the English word emotions mean. So it's like someone may translate it as emotion, but they don't really mean it the way emotions means in English. Usually, midah or midot are defined as some type of measurement or proportion or dimension. And essentially one of the ways it's also defined as a manner, ways, character, nature, or condition. So it'd be like saying if I'm trying to describe your condition or your nature, I can describe it using the word midot or midah. So it's like someone who has good midot would be like someone who has a good nature, good manners or ways. But someone who has bad midot would be considered to be someone who doesn't have good manners, characteristics, or nature or condition. But if you think about it, it's like saying, okay, well, someone who has good emotions, bad emotions. Well, everybody's got emotions, and everybody has a right to have an emotion about something. How you manage it, could be considered like midot, like how you manage like your character, how you manage the nature that you have. But generally speaking, when you're talking about emotions, most of the time, most people wouldn't use midot. It'd be regesh in modern Hebrew. But again, that can vary. But if you look in many modern Hebrew dictionaries, usually midot or midah is not defined as emotions. Usually regesh is defined that way. So let's take a look at, there's a site from different rabbis called Hidabrut. And Hidabrut is a site here in Israel that deals a lot with answering questions for Jews, who, have questions about the Torah, teaching Torah to Jews here in Israel, as well as, the idea of helping Jews return back to the Torah for those who have been lost to it. So one of the questions that they received on their site in 2022, like February, actually, in February, um, was concerning this idea, where it says at the top, Ha'im le'Elohim yesh lo regashot kamo leven adam. So essentially the question that I presented at the very beginning in the name of the video. This person asked, is it possible to say that Hashem has emotions like a human being, like a regashot, like a human being? So this is the basic question. I won't go through the whole question, but essentially the person asking, like, does Hashem, get angry? Does Hashem, get happy? Things like that. Does, Hashem, can be afraid of things like that. And this is what the person is dealing with. They ask some other questions too, but I'll deal with the emotion part of it. So the response that the rabbi gave to them is this part here, where initially he highlights, and he mentioned initially that, Hashem loves us, things like that, but then he defined what he means by that. So he says, Ach Elohim eno rotze devarim o ko'es ka'adam. So what this translates into is that Hashem, the creator of all things, which, another term we use is Elohim or Elohim, he, doesn't have, desires or wants, for things, or get angry like a person. So he gives a couple of examples, like, from the Tanakh, where he says, like, L'dugma ne'amar ben Navi. So the prophet, for example, says, Ha'oti hem ha'machisim ne'um Hashem, halo atem lema'an boshet panehem. So he's quoting Yirmiyahu, or Jeremiah 7, 19. And then it continues, it says, V'chi haka'as hu ha'ovorim, ki ma'asehem mezikim li, halo ha'achas yizik lahem, ki yiyeh lahem levushat ulachlima. So this is like a description from the commentator on it. So it says, Re'e od b'mareh, and it says, like, V'him Elokim yesh lo ratzon. So he gives another article, but basically what he's saying is that when you look at the Tanakh, it tells us that Hashem is not like a person in terms, if if you want to use the terms that we're using, Hashem doesn't have the kind of wants and like anger like a person has. It doesn't operate that way in any way. And the article will explain even further what that means in just a bit. So continuing in the response that the rabbi gave, he mentioned something, that is something that isn't often understood outside of certain circles. What he mentions here, starting in the non-highlight parts, is that there's no real such thing in reality as something that's bad. That all things that we perceive to be bad always have a good turn to them. The creator of all things put it that way. So there are some situations where we may think it's bad, but there are some, really situations where, there's an ability for us to grow from them and go past, what our normal perceptions are and come close to the Creator through the Torah. And that all things, were put, on this planet for the good, to benefit humanity. We have to just simply want it to be that way, and we have to work towards it being that way. So, he basically, gets into this idea, and then getting to the highlight part, where he's explaining more about this. He says, Elohim hu ein sofi umushlam. So he says that, the creator of all things, Hashem, is ein sofi. And ein sofi is usually a term we use to kind of say infinite, meaning that, eternal. But again, it's like saying beyond humanity, because even if infinite and eternal kind of have certain ideas that people have. And he says also umushlam. So Hashem is complete. There is no, lacking. He gets into that in just a second. He says, Ein etzlo gevulot velo chisronot mishum sug. So he says that Hashem lacks, has no boundaries, meaning that there's nothing putting boundaries on Hashem. Hashem, dictates, exactly what Hashem is going to do or not going to do, and what the reality is for all of us. But Hashem lacks nothing also in any way, in any form. So there's no lacking. It'd be like saying if the earth wasn't here, Hashem wouldn't be in lacking, or of anything. If people choose not to like do anything to, say that Hashem exists, it wouldn't be a lacking on the side of Hashem. And he continues, "Ve'en davar sheyachol lahatzik min ha'adam." So it's basically like saying there's no real way, 100%, that we can actually, as people, present something about Hashem. Because Hashem is beyond us. Especially if you're saying He's Ein Sofi Umushlam. There's no such thing like that in our realm of reality. So we're lacking in our ability to describe Hashem. And it says, "Umikan shekol ma she'aseh Hashem hu rak latova." So he says, like, from this, we understand that from, that basically everything that Hashem does, it's always for the good. He says, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, meaning, Hashem, the set apart one. Vadai eino ma'anish al chataim b'torat nekama. So he says that like Hashem does not, punish those who transgress either the Torah or the Sheva Mitzvot of Noach, the seven Mitzvot of Noach, out of like revenge. So it's not like Hashem is like taking revenge against people, in that way. So he says, Shehare kol matoroto hu lehativ la'adam. So he says like, and his basic goal, is to provide the good for humanity. בדומה לאב שרוצה לקדם את בניו ולהועיל להם. So he's like saying that basically it's like no different than a father who wants to, progress his children, and basically elevate them, and there are times where a father, has to punish, their children, but not because they like enjoy it, but it's for the good, to make sure that they are turning into the right people. And punishment can be different for different children, so. So continuing with this part of the article, going a little bit further into it, in the highlighted part again, it says, "Ke'et atatzodek shenision ladamot et Elohim laadam zuhui anashim." So essentially, what he's saying, like this, he's going back to the person who asked the question, and I didn't really get to their question specifically, but he's like saying that, no, you're correct, that that basically it's kind of like a human thing to associate certain things that are human to Hashem, for example. To kind of, make them out, because that's the only way we could even have a conversation. He says, Ki Elohim eno choshev umargish kefi ha'adam choshev umargish. So he says that Hashem doesn't think or feel, the way that a human being thinks or feels. So continuing, skipping part of the next part, getting back into the other highlighted part, he says, Ki Elohim eno dome le'af koach teva. So he says that Hashem, doesn't resemble any form of power that we see in nature, in the natural world that we live in, for example, that we were created into. Lo letochuna velo lemachshev. So essentially, he's like saying that there's nothing. Hashem is nothing like what we experience, for example. In terms of the character of Hashem. And then continue, he says, Im Elokim hu ma'avar leregeshot en safek שהוא גם מעבר לדמיונים אנושיים של מחשבים של רובוטים. So he gets into this idea that I mentioned earlier, that basically Hashem is beyond us, and you can't really. It's like saying here, he mentions like about humanity and robots, that essentially, Hashem, if if you want to say something about about the feelings of Hashem, even if you want to say that, it'd be way above anything we could even say about people or even robots, for example, just way above anything. And he continues, says Elohim hu ma'avar lechol musag shenatan lehoalot ala da'at ha'anoshit ben sechel uven ragshim. So Hashem is beyond what we consider to be our own intelligence and beyond our own feelings, for example. So continuing a little bit further, I'll skip the part at the top. Well, actually, I'll cover a little bit at the top, where he says, "Ach ovodam shelokim hu ba'al shekol, ki hu bara olam sikli meod." And what he said, ba'al sechel. So it's basically like saying that Hashem created the universe and created everything with intelligence, but not human intelligence. Just what we can look at and say, okay, well, the order of the universe has an order to it, and it's put in place in a way where something that was intelligent had to have put it there. But again, it's beyond our intelligence, and that's what he mentions in the non-highlight parts at the top. So getting into the highlight part right below that, ach gam muvan lanu she'elokim ein moach legalgolet. So it's like saying that Hashem doesn't have a brain or a mind inside of a skull like we do. והשכל שלנו יתברך שונה ונעלה מכל השכל שנוכל לדמיין. So basically, it's like saying that the intelligence we have, it's different. You can't even compare it to, what Hashem is about and what Hashem is. It's not comparable. It's like what I've been saying earlier. It's just you can't even compare it. He says, "Ein lanu yocholet letaer et intelligentsia shel haborei." So we can't even, we don't have the ability to even like describe the intelligence of the Creator. Ki intelligentsia shelo he me'al o me'ever lazo shel ha'asagat ha'anoshit. So it's like saying the intelligence of Hashem is beyond, the grasp of humanity. בדיוק באותו דרך עלינו להבין שמסוגים כמו אהבה ורחמים אצל האלוקים גבוהים ושונים לגמרי מכל רגש שאנו כבני אדם נוכל להציג. So he says that, for example, the concepts of love and almost like rachamim. I think like one of the ways to describe it is like it's almost like a type of mercy, but like the way that the provision the Creator provides for us in a certain way. It's so high up there and so different, so much different than the emotions and what we understand to be regesh, so that we can't even fully grasp it. כמו שאלוקים יש שכל שמתפתה בעולם, אך הוא ודאי לא שכל אנושי שנוכל להציג ולהבין. So it's like saying that like for example, the Creator we mentioned earlier in the previous video, that we can look at how the world works and define certain things about the character of the Creator based on those things, but we can't place it within a human context. Because of the fact that it's not human intelligence. The Creator is beyond all of that, and it's beyond what we could even grasp or even understand. So gam kach yesh lo elokim ahava, ach lo ahava anoshit shenuchal latzig ulavin. So he's like saying that the Creator has love, but nothing that we could ever be able to grasp or even understand. So what that basically means is it's not human in any way. And this is what the Rishonim are getting at, and the Geonim, that when someone says, okay, well, does the Creator have emotions? It's like, well, the easy answer would be like, that's not even a relevant question, because we're talking about something beyond human grasp. Now, if you want to say, okay, well, does Hashem provide for the Jewish people? Yes. Has Hashem given the Torah? Yes. Can you call that love? Sure, why not? The Torah says it can be called that, but is it like love the way we want to define it, and can you break it down the way humans do? No. It's you have to understand it's beyond you. Again, it's perfectly permissible to say things about it, but again, if you're trying to get into something technical, which when people deal with emotions, the Creator has emotions like a person. Of course not. The Creator is not a person. It's, beyond humanity. And if you want to use the English word or even the Hebrew word, you have to understand that the language is lacking. This is the best that we can produce, because at some point we do have to talk about something. So lastly, this rabbi states, Ulechen Ne'amar, שמי שברא את הרגישות שלנו, ודאי מבין מהם רגישות. So he says that, of course, thus that whatever, created, our emotions, obviously understands them. פירוש הדבר שאלוקים מבין אותך יותר ממה שאתה מבין את עצמך. So he says that, it's clear, that, basically that, the definition of the matter is that Hashem understands all of us better than we even understand ourselves. הוא אבא שלך יותר מכל אבא שיכול להיות ליצור כלשהו עלי אדמות, כי הוא קרוב אליך. So it's like saying, okay, that the creator of all things could be considered like a father to you, more than any father on the earthly realm could even be considered a father, because the creator is closer to you than any father you have. הוא היוצר שלך, he created you, ויש לו כוונה ורצון לגבי מעשיך ותכליתך הטובה. So basically the creator wants good for you as a person, so I mean, again, that's way above and beyond any like father that wants, a certain type of good, but the creator like wants good beyond that, and that's the will of the creator. כל דבר שאתה מבין או מרגיש נובע ממנו, יתברך והחלטתו לגביך, והוא יודע ומבין את כל מה שאתה חושב עכשיו עליו ולגביו. So it's like saying the creator understands everything that you're thinking about the creator and understands the nature of humanity better than we even do. And this is something that's very clear because Hashem created every aspect of who we are. So in closing, hopefully this video series, it's something I felt like I needed to do because I was involved in a debate about this issue. And what I kept trying to get at was that in the debate that took place was that, the English terminology is not sufficient because even the Hebrew terminology is not sufficient because the creator of all things is beyond all of us. So if a person wants to say, well, the creator has emotions, kind of like describing it in the way that a human has, the answer to that would be no. The creator is not a human and has no emotions like a human. Now, if a person wants to say, well, then what does that mean for humanity? Because the creator does not care? It's like, well, that's not even a relevant question. The creator is beyond all these ideas. But because of the fact the creator created a universe, created laws of like the way the universe works, placed humanity within that, gave us possibilities, and then gave us free will and allows us to make decisions, of what we're going to do and what we're not going to do, even if it's against our own benefit, that, it could be defined as love, as clearly as possible. So we can say the creator has love. The Torah tells us that can be considered love. But again, if we want to even use the word love, it's beyond any concept that humans have of what love even is. So it'd be like saying that most kids don't understand when they're kids, most of the time, the love their parents have for them. They sometimes don't even understand until they have their own kids. Now take that and multiply it times a number that you can't even fathom. That if you want to say this is love, it's way beyond what you can describe as being love, and it becomes something else. Something above and beyond what we can even use words to describe. So again, this is the point that I was getting at. I hope I've made it clear through these videos. I apologize for it being long. But again, I think that this covers all the issues that I feel like I needed to kind of get out because of this conversation that I had that really affected me because of the way that, there was somebody in the conversation who was going all these weird directions and was misrepresenting things I was writing. And because it's writing, sometimes it's not as easy to express the idea. But, no matter how I tried to get it across, it seemed the person was kind of looking for some way to say that they're right. And sometimes they were saying the same thing I was saying. But, this is where I really felt like I needed to put this in a video to kind of like fully get that off my chest, if you will. So this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever. Take care, and hopefully I'll see you in the next video.